The crunch of metal cut through the Chicago afternoon like a gunshot. Mason Brooks turned just in time to watch a midnight black Bentley fold the rear of his taxi like a soda can. That dented yellow cab was not just a car, it was rent. It was his daughter's dinner. It was the heart surgery his mother could not afford. A woman stepped out of the Bentley, heels clicking against the asphalt. Charlotte Sinclair looked at the wreckage, then at the crowd, and she smiled. This car should have been in a scrapyard years ago. The crowd laughed. Mason said nothing. He simply stood there, swallowing the humiliation, his hands trembling at his sides. Charlotte had no idea who she had just insulted, and she had no idea that the fate binding these two worlds had only just begun. The chaos of the intersection faded slowly, the way a wound goes numb before it begins to throb. Mason Brooks crouched beside his ruined taxi, long after the Bentley had pulled away, running his fingers along the crushed steel as if his touch could somehow smooth it back into shape. The crowd had dispersed. The laughter was gone. What remained was a yellow cab folded at an ugly angle, and a man kneeling in the street with a business card crumpled in his fist. He had not asked for an apology. He had only asked quietly whether she might help cover the repairs, and she had answered with a smile that he would not forget for a long time. Mason was 38 years old, though the lines around his eyes belonged to a man closer to 50. There had been a different life once in a clean office on the 12th floor of a downtown building where he had worn pressed shirts and chased numbers across glowing screens. He had been one of the finest forensic accountants in the city, the man banks called when money disappeared, and no one could explain where it had gone. He had a gift for it, a way of reading a ledger the way other people read faces, sensing the lie beneath a clean column of figures. Then his wife got sick, the kind of sick that does not negotiate. The bills came faster than any salary could answer, and when she was gone, the office and the pressed shirts felt like artifacts from a museum of someone else's existence. He needed work that bent to a child's school schedule, work he could leave at a moment's notice when a fever spiked or a nurse called. So he traded the 12th floor for a driver's seat, and he told no one who he had been. It was easier that way. A man who once tracked stolen fortunes did not need anyone's pity when he was counting tips at the end of a long shift. His daughter was the reason for all of it. Sophie was 9 years old with a gap where her front tooth used to be, and a stubborn brightness that the apartment's peeling walls could not dim. She kept a jar on the kitchen windowsill, labeled in her own careful handwriting, Grandma's Heart. Every coin Mason could spare went into that jar, and every coin Sophie found on the sidewalk went into it too. They were nowhere close to the number the surgeons had quoted, but she counted it every Sunday, all the same, sliding the coins across the table and announcing the total like good news. His mother Eleanor lived with them in the cramped 2-bedroom on the west side. Her heart was failing by slow degrees, a valve that grew weaker each month, and the cardiologist's voice had grown gentler in a way that frightened Mason more than any warning could. She spent her days in a worn armchair by the window, and she never once complained, which somehow made it worse. When Mason came home that evening with grease on his hands and the story of the accident he could not bring himself to tell, she only looked at his face and said his dinner was on the stove. He did not mention the woman from the Bentley. He did not mention that the car which fed all three of them now sat in a lot waiting on money he did not have. He kissed Sophie's forehead, helped his mother to bed, and sat alone in the dark kitchen with the crumpled business card on the table in front of him. The name embossed on it meant nothing to him then. Charlotte Sinclair, Chief Executive Officer, Sinclair Holdings. To Charlotte, the accident had been a footnote to a far worse day. She had spent the morning in a glass conference room, arguing with a board that questioned every decision she made, the way they had questioned her since the moment she inherited her title, rather than earning it in their eyes. She was 31, the daughter of the man who had built Sinclair Holdings from a single warehouse into one of the largest logistics empires in the Midwest, and she carried the weight of that legacy like armor that had been forged for someone else's shoulders. She was sharp. She was relentless. And somewhere along the climb, she had learned to look at the world from a great height where ordinary people blurred into scenery. She did not think about the taxi driver again. She had a wedding to plan, a company to defend, and a fiancé who told her that very night over dinner that she worried too much. His name was Victor Hale, and he was everything the board wished Charlotte would become. He was the company's chief operating officer, polished and warm, the sort of man who remembered the names of every executive's children and asked after them with a sincerity no one questioned. He had courted Charlotte for 2 years, and her father trusted him completely. When Robert Sinclair spoke of the future, he spoke of Victor in it, and Charlotte had come to believe that her father's faith was the soundest investment in her life. Across the table from them sat Charlotte's younger brother, Daniel, 22, and still uncertain of his place in a family that measured worth in deals closed. He had finished college only the year before, and now he drifted through the company learning the business he was expected to one day help lead. He laughed too eagerly at Victor's jokes. He looked to his sister for approval she was often too distracted to give. He was in the way of younger siblings, everywhere, easy to overlook. And that night, no one at the table imagined how much would one day hinge on him. The video changed everything. A bystander had filmed the accident on a phone, and by the next morning, the clip had spread across the city like a spilled drink across a tablecloth. There was the Bentley, the wreck, the woman in the heels. There was her smile, and the line about the scrapyard captured in crisp audio for anyone to replay. There was the taxi driver standing silent in the street, taking the insult without a word, and there was something in his stillness that made strangers furious on his behalf. The comments multiplied by the thousands. The footage reached people it had no business reaching. It reached Robert Sinclair on a Tuesday in his study in the home where he had raised both his children. He watched it 3 times. Then he set the tablet down on his desk and stared out the window for a long while, and the disappointment that settled over his face was not the kind that fades by morning. He had built his fortune among working men. He had loaded trucks himself, once had slept in the cab of one during a snowstorm with a thermos of cold coffee, and he had never forgotten the smell of that life or the dignity of the people who lived it. To see his daughter laugh at a man whose livelihood she had just destroyed was to see reflected back at him a failure he could not entirely blame on her. He had given her everything except the one thing that mattered. He had never taught her to see. He did not call her in to scold her. Robert Sinclair was not a man who solved problems by raising his voice. Instead, he picked up the phone and made a few quiet inquiries about the driver in the video, the man whose name the news had not yet learned. What came back surprised him. The driver had no record, no debts beyond the medical kind, and a reputation among the dispatchers as the most reliable man on the roster. He gave up fares to ferry an elderly passenger to the right door. He had once driven 2 hours past the end of his shift to return a wallet a customer left in his back seat. There was a daughter. There was a sick mother. There was a quiet, unbreakable steadiness to the man that no amount of poverty had managed to grind down. Robert read it all twice. Then an idea took shape in his mind, the kind of idea that seems reckless at first, and then, the longer one sits with it, begins to look like wisdom. He found Mason at the dispatch lot 2 days later. Mason was wiping down the interior of a borrowed cab, the only car the company could spare him, while his own waited on repairs he could not pay for, when a black sedan eased to a stop a few feet away. An older man climbed out unhurried, dressed in a gray coat that probably cost more than Mason earned in 3 months, though there was nothing in his manner that announced it. He crossed the cracked asphalt and offered his hand, and Mason took it warily, because men in coats like that did not come to dispatch lots without a reason. "My name is Robert Sinclair," the man said. "I believe you've met my daughter." Mason's jaw tightened, and he let go of the handshake. If this is about the lawsuit, I'm not filing one. I just want my car fixed. That's all I ever wanted. It isn't about a lawsuit." Robert glanced at the dented taxi visible through the chain-link fence at the far end of the lot, then back at Mason. "I came to apologize for something my daughter should have apologized for herself, and I came to offer you a job." Mason almost laughed. "I have a job. You have a car you can't afford to repair, and a mother who needs care you can't afford to give her." Robert said it gently without cruelty, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. "I'm not telling you anything you don't lie awake thinking about. I looked into you, Mr. Brooks. I hope you'll forgive me for that. I needed to know what kind of man I was talking to." The use of his name unsettled Mason more than the rest of it. He folded the rag in his hands, slowly measuring the stranger in front of him. "And what kind of man did you decide I was?" "The kind my daughter needs to spend some time around." Robert leaned against the sedan, and for a moment he looked less like a billionaire and more like any tired father at the end of a hard week. "Charlotte has forgotten where this family came from. I won't bore you with whose fault that is. But I've come to believe that she won't learn it from me or from anyone in the world she lives in. She might learn it from you. I'd like to hire you as her personal driver. 3 months. Your wages will be 10 times what you make now, and I'll arrange the best cardiac care in the city for your mother, regardless of how the arrangement ends." The number landed in the silence between them, and Mason felt the ground shift beneath everything he had braced himself against. 10 times his wages. A surgeon for his mother. The jar on the windowsill suddenly seemed very small and very far away. Every instinct he had told him to refuse. He thought of the woman in the heels, the smile, the line that the whole city had now memorized. He thought of standing in that street while strangers laughed, and of how it would feel to open a car door for that woman every morning and say nothing. "You're asking me to drive the person who humiliated me," he said. "You understand that. I'm asking you to be exactly who you already are in front of someone who badly needs to witness it." Robert pushed off the sedan and straightened his coat. "I won't pretend it's a kindness to you. It isn't. It's a kindness I'm asking from you for a daughter who doesn't deserve it yet. The only thing I can offer in return is everything you've been losing sleep over." Mason looked away toward the far fence and the ruined yellow shape behind it. He thought of Sophie counting coins on a Sunday afternoon. He thought of his mother in the armchair by the window, never complaining, her breath growing shorter by the month. He thought of how many years it would take at his current wages to reach the number the surgeons had named, and he understood with a cold and simple clarity that he did not have that many years before the math stopped mattering. Pride was a luxury. He had learned that lesson once already in a clean office on the 12th floor, and he was about to learn it again. "When would I start?" he asked. Robert allowed himself a small, weary smile, the first real warmth he had shown. "Monday. And Mr. Brooks, she won't make it easy on you. I want you to know that going in. My daughter is not cruel by nature. She has only been protected from everything that might have made her kind. There's a difference, though. It won't always feel like one." He extended his hand again, and this time Mason took it without hesitation, and the bargain was sealed in a parking lot under a gray Chicago sky. That night, Mason told his mother only that he had found better-paying work driving for a private family. Eleanor studied his face the way she always did, and whatever she saw there, she chose not to question it. Sophie wanted to know if the new car would have leather seats. Mason laughed for the first time in days and told her he supposed it might. He did not tell either of them the name of the family. He did not yet know how to say it without the sting returning. He lay awake long into the night, the way Robert had guessed he would, and he stared at the water stain on the ceiling and tried to imagine the months ahead. He imagined the woman from the Bentley in the back seat of a car he was paid to drive, and he imagined biting his tongue through every insult she chose to deliver. What he could not imagine in the dark of that cramped apartment, with the heart-shaped jar glowing faintly in the moonlight, was that the woman he had every reason to hate, would one day owe him her family, her fortune, and very nearly her life. But that was still months away. On Monday, there was only the job and the long, quiet road that led toward it. Monday came gray and cold, and Mason arrived at the Sinclair estate 20 minutes early, because a man who has been poor does not gamble with first impressions. He was given a charcoal suit that fit too well to be an accident, and the keys to a car worth more than the building he lived in. When Charlotte came down the front steps and saw who would be opening her door, the recognition flickered across her face, followed quickly by something colder. "My father has a sense of humor," she said, sliding into the back seat without waiting for him to reach the handle. "I didn't realize charity cases came with a driver's license." Mason closed the door without a word and took his place behind the wheel. The first week was a slow education in contempt. Charlotte had a talent for it, a way of folding insult into ordinary instruction so that the wound never quite reached the surface. She remarked on the smell of his cologne, which he did not wear. She asked with theatrical patience whether men of his background understood how to take an exit ramp. When he held a door, she walked through it as though doors simply opened for women like her, the hand that held them invisible. He absorbed all of it, the way he had absorbed the laughter in the street, with a stillness that gave her nothing to push against. That stillness was the thing she could not solve. She had expected him to flinch, or to flatter, or to seethe in a way she could detect in the rearview mirror. Instead, he drove. He drove well, and he listened to her phone calls without reaction, and when she tested him with cruelty, he answered with a calm so complete that it began against all reason to unsettle her. People did not behave this way around her. People wanted things from her, and their wanting made them legible. This man wanted nothing she could see, and the mystery of it began to itch. It was during the second week that she made the mistake of asking him a real question. They were stuck in traffic on Lakeshore Drive, late for a dinner she did not want to attend, and the silence had stretched long enough that she filled it without thinking. "You drove a taxi for years. Doesn't it bore you? The same streets, the same strangers going nowhere?" "I never went nowhere," Mason said, watching the road. "Every fare was someone somewhere. A woman going to chemo, a kid going to his first job. You learn the whole city that way, the parts that don't show up in a quarterly report." She had not expected that, and she did not answer. But she stopped insulting him after that day, not out of warmth, but because the insults had begun to feel like throwing stones at a wall and watching them land on her own feet. The thing that changed everything happened on a Thursday, and it happened because Mason had become invisible. That was the first lesson of the driver's seat, the one he had learned years ago in the taxi and never forgotten. To the people in the back, the man at the wheel was furniture. He was a function. They conducted their lives in the back seat as though the glass between the front and rear were soundproof, as though the eyes in the mirror belonged to no one. Mason had heard marriages end in his back seat. He had heard fortunes discussed and crimes half confessed, all by people who would not have recognized his face an hour later. So when Victor Hale climbed into the car beside a board member named Gerald Pruitt one evening, neither of them gave the driver a second glance. Charlotte had asked Mason to ferry the two men downtown while she finished a meeting. They settled into the leather seats and began to talk, low and easy, the talk of men who believed themselves unobserved. Mason kept his eyes on the road and his face arranged into nothing, and he let the words wash over him the way he always did. But these words did not wash over him. They caught. It was the phrasing that snagged first the particular grammar of a thing being hidden. Victor spoke of moving funds through an intermediary of a vendor in another state, whose invoices never quite matched the services rendered. Pruitt asked about the timeline, and Victor said the structure would be in place before the wedding, that by the time anyone thought to look, the trail would run through a dozen shells and dead end in a country with no extradition. He laughed at his own cleverness. He said Robert was too old to notice, and Charlotte too busy defending herself to defend the company. To any other driver, it would have been noise. To Mason, it was a language he had once spoken fluently, the dialect of stolen money. He had spent years learning exactly how fortunes disappeared, the architecture of the lie, the way clean numbers were built to hide dirty ones. And what he heard in the back seat of that car was not the careless talk of an ambitious executive. It was a blueprint. He said nothing. He delivered the two men to their destination, wished them a good evening in the flat voice of a servant, and drove home with his heart hammering against his ribs. For 3 nights, he told himself it was none of his concern. He had a daughter to raise, and a mother to save, and the politics of the rich were a fire that burned hottest for those who got close to it. Let them rob each other. The woman who had laughed at him in the street was not owed his loyalty, and her fiancé's schemes were not his to expose. But Mason had never been able to leave a lie alone once he had seen the shape of it. It was the flaw that had made him good at his old work, and the flaw that would not let him sleep now. So he began quietly to look. He had no access to the company's books, but he did not need much. He had the names he had overheard, and he had a memory trained to hold numbers the way other men held grudges. In the long hours waiting outside restaurants and office towers, he listened more carefully than he ever had. He noted which calls Victor took outside the car and which he took inside it. He memorized the name of the out-of-state vendor when Victor mentioned it a second time, and on his own laptop. At his own kitchen table after Sophie had gone to bed, he started pulling the public threads. A business registration here, a dissolved partnership there, a corporate address that turned out to be a mailbox in a strip mall. Piece by piece, the pattern he had heard in the back seat assembled itself on the screen in front of him, and what it showed him made his stomach turn. This was not skimming. This was a man preparing to gut a company from the inside and walk away wearing its skin. He did not know how to tell her. He only knew that he had to. The chance came sooner than he wanted, and it came wrapped in an entirely different crisis. The car broke down on a Saturday, a failure of the cooling system that left them stranded on a road, far from anywhere Charlotte recognized, in a neighborhood she would never have entered by choice. The replacement vehicle was an hour out. It was raining. And Mason, with the apologetic practicality of a man who had spent his life solving problems with his hands, told her that his own apartment was 4 blocks away, and that she was welcome to wait there rather than in a disabled car on the shoulder. She agreed only because the alternative was worse, and she climbed the stairs of his building with the wary posture of a woman entering a country she had been warned about. What she found there undid something in her. The apartment was small and worn, the paint peeling at the corners, the furniture chosen for endurance rather than beauty. But it was clean, and it was warm, and it was unmistakably loved. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator. There was a heart-shaped jar on the windowsill half full of coins, with a child's handwriting on the label. And there was a girl of 9 with a gap in her smile, who looked up from her homework and announced to the stranger dripping rainwater in her doorway that she liked her shoes. "Thank you," Charlotte said, and found that she meant it. Sophie was not impressed by wealth because she had never been close enough to it to learn she was supposed to be. She was impressed that Charlotte knew how to fold a paper crane, a skill Charlotte had not used since childhood, and did not know she still possessed until her hands remembered it at the kitchen table. She showed Charlotte the jar and explained with the grave seriousness of a child that it was for her grandmother's heart, and that they were saving up and that they were getting close. Charlotte looked at the coins, at the careful handwriting, at the number that was not close at all, and something in her chest pulled tight. In the next room, an old woman in an armchair by the window watched the rain. Eleanor Brooks had the kind of face that had stopped pretending years ago, and when Charlotte was introduced, she took the younger woman's hand in both of her own and held it a moment longer than courtesy required, as though reading something in it. "You work my son very hard," Eleanor said, not unkindly. "He works hard," Charlotte answered, which was true, and which she had never once said aloud. When the replacement car finally arrived, Charlotte did not want to leave, and the wanting confused her. She had spent 2 weeks looking for the crack in Mason Brooks, the angle, the lever, the thing he wanted that would make him comprehensible. And she had found it at last, and it was nothing she could buy or threaten. It was a sick mother, and a bright child, and a jar of coins on a windowsill. It was a man giving everything he had to people who could give him nothing back, and asking for no audience while he did it. She rode home in silence, and for the first time the silence was not a weapon. The thing about a wall you have been throwing stones at is that once you stop, you begin to wonder what is on the other side. Over the following days, Charlotte found herself talking to Mason rather than at him. She asked about Sophie's school. She asked awkwardly about the surgery, and listened without offering to fix it, because she had begun to understand that he would not have wanted her to. She caught herself watching him in the mirror, not for weakness now, but for something steadier, and she did not examine too closely what that something was. It was into that fragile, warming silence that Mason finally said the thing he had been carrying. He chose a moment when they were alone, and far from any office parked outside a building she had asked him to wait beside. He turned in his seat to face her directly, which he had never done, and he told her plainly, and without softening it, what he had heard and what he had found. He told her about the back seat, and the vendor, and the shells, and the country, with no extradition. He told her the name at the center of it. Her face went white, and then it went hard. "Get out," she said. "Charlotte, you don't get to say his name like that. You don't get to come into my family." And her voice cracked, and she forced it level. "Victor has been beside me for 2 years. My father trusts him with everything. You've been here 3 weeks, and you expect me to believe a driver over the man I'm going to marry." "I expect you to look," Mason said. "That's all. Don't believe me. Look for yourself." He handed her a folder, thin, assembled at his kitchen table over a week of sleepless nights. She did not open it in front of him. She told him to drive her home, and she said nothing else the entire way. And he thought with a hollow certainty that he had ruined the one fragile thing that had been forming between them, and that he had done it for a woman who had laughed at him in the street. But she opened the folder that night. She opened it alone in her study, expecting to find the spite of a bitter man and the easy answer that would let her dismiss him. Instead, she found dates and registrations and a corporate address that resolved to a mailbox in a strip mall, and the slow, sickening recognition that everything in front of her was real. She found the architecture of a betrayal built so patiently that she had walked through it every day without seeing the walls. She thought of Victor's hand on hers at dinner, his easy laugh, the way he had told her she worried too much. She understood now what he had needed her to worry about least. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. She sat in the dark, with the folder open on her desk, and felt the floor of her life tilt beneath her, and the only steady thing in her mind, absurdly, was the image of a man who had every reason to let her fall, and had chosen instead to warn her. The next morning she did not insult her driver. She sat behind him in silence for a long while, and then she said very quietly, "How long have you known how to read things like this?" "Longer than I've driven a cab," Mason answered. She let that sit. She did not ask the rest of it. But she understood in that moment that the man her father had hired to teach her humility was something other than what he appeared, and that she had spent 3 weeks being unkind to a person who might be the only ally she had left. What neither of them knew was that Victor had begun to notice the driver too. It was a small thing at first, the kind of detail a careful man cannot help but catalogue. Charlotte had grown quiet around him. She no longer brought the company's troubles to his desk, the way she once had. And she watched her driver in a way that a fiancé learns to read, not with desire exactly, but with trust, which was far more dangerous. Victor had spent 2 years making himself indispensable to this family, and he had not done it by ignoring the small things. He made a quiet inquiry of his own. He learned what Robert had never thought to dig for, that Mason Brooks was not merely a taxi driver, that there had been another life, a 12th floor life, years of tracking exactly the kind of money Victor was now moving. And where Robert had seen a man worth saving, Victor saw a threat that had to be removed. The pressure began in ways designed to look like accidents. A man in a parked car began appearing outside Sophie's school, gone before anyone could be sure he had been there at all. Eleanor's appointments at the cardiology clinic grew suddenly complicated. Her paperwork, lost her referrals, delayed the careful arrangement Robert had set up, unraveling thread by thread for reasons no one could quite name. And then at the company, a story began to circulate that confidential documents had gone missing and that the man who had taken them was the driver. The charity case, the one the chairman had so foolishly let inside. Mason understood the message exactly. He had seen this kind of pressure applied before from the other side of it. It was the squeeze of a powerful man who has identified a weakness, and Mason's weakness was the two people he loved most in the world. Charlotte came to him frightened in a way he had not seen before. "He knows," she said. "Victor knows you've been looking. You have to leave Mason, take your family, and go somewhere he can't reach you. This isn't your fight, and I won't watch him destroy you for trying to protect me." "And if I leave," Mason said, "what happens to you?" She did not have an answer, and her silence was the answer. "I spent years walking away from messes that weren't mine," he told her. "I told myself it was wisdom. It was just fear wearing a nicer coat. I'm not doing it again." He did not leave, and in not leaving, he forced Victor's hand. The final blow fell across a single brutal week, and it fell with the precision of a thing that had been planned for months. It began in the boardroom. Victor had spent 2 years buying loyalty among the directors, and now he spent it all at once. They moved against Charlotte, while she was still reeling, citing the plunging stock, the public scandal of the viral video, the rumors of leaked documents, and they voted to suspend her as chief executive of the company her father had built. She walked out of the building she had run that morning, a private citizen, the cameras already gathered on the steps, as though they had been told where to wait. The shock of it reached Robert in his study, and his heart, which had carried this family for so long, finally faltered under the weight. He collapsed in the room where he had watched the video that started everything, and by the time the ambulance reached him, he was gray and barely breathing, and the doctors spoke afterward in the same gentle voices Mason had learned to dread. The one man who might have stopped all of this lay in an intensive care unit, unable to lift a hand, and then Daniel disappeared. He had gone to the office late to retrieve something, the way younger brothers do when they are trying to be useful, and he did not come home. A message arrived on Charlotte's phone in the small hours, a photograph of her brother, in a room she did not recognize, and a single line of text beneath it. The price of his return was the family's controlling shares. Sign them over, and Daniel comes home. Resist, and he does not. By dawn, the markets had opened, and the stock was in freefall. By noon, the news had turned on Charlotte, completely recasting the woman from the viral video as the villain of every story they could invent. And as Mason sat in his kitchen, reading the headlines on his cracked laptop screen, a knock came at his door, and through the window he saw the police who had come to arrest him for the theft and forgery of documents he had never touched. Charlotte had lost the company. Mason had lost his name. Robert lay dying. Daniel was gone. Everything they had was on the floor, and the man who had pushed it there was at that very hour standing before the cameras with a sorrowful expression, promising the world that he would do everything in his power to set the Sinclair family right. The holding cell smelled of bleach and old coffee, and Mason Brooks sat on a steel bench with his hands folded, doing the one thing he had always been good at when the world came apart. He thought, They had taken his belt and his shoelaces and the cracked laptop from his kitchen table, but they could not take what was already in his head, and they had not thought to look at the small camera mounted behind the rearview mirror of the car he drove. It was a habit left over from his taxi. Years a cheap dashboard recorder that ran whenever the engine did. Drivers kept them for accidents, for the fares who claimed they had been overcharged, for the rare passenger who turned dangerous. Mason had kept his running out of pure reflex, and he had nearly forgotten it existed until the steel door clanged shut behind him, and his memory, sharpened by fear, handed him the one thing that might matter. Every word Victor Hale had spoken in that back seat had been recorded. The vendor, the shells, the country with no extradition, all of it in Victor's own voice, captured by a $40 device he had never once noticed. But the recording sat on a memory card in a car now impounded by the same people who had arrested him, and Mason was behind a locked door with a single phone call to his name. He spent it carefully. The man who answered on the third ring had not heard Mason's voice in years, but he knew it at once. Frank Delaney had been a colleague in the old life, back when Mason wore pressed shirts and chased stolen fortunes across spreadsheets. Frank had left the private sector for a federal badge, and he now ran financial crime investigations for the kind of agency that did not lose interest once it took hold of something. Mason told him everything in 4 minutes, fast and flat, the way you brief a man who fills in the gaps himself. He told him about Victor, about the structure, about the recording on the impounded card, about a young man named Daniel, who was somewhere in the dark with his life held hostage to a signature. Frank listened without interrupting, and when Mason finished, he said only, "Sit tight. Don't talk to anyone but me." What Mason did not know was that Charlotte was already trying to reach him. She had hit a place lower than she had known existed. The company her father built had been voted out from under her. Her father lay gray and silent in an intensive care unit. Her brother was a photograph and a threat on her phone, and the man she had been going to marry stood before the cameras grieving her family's misfortune, with a face she now understood to be a mask. There was no one left to call. The directors had turned. The lawyers spoke in careful conditionals, and in the wreckage of every relationship she had trusted, the only name that did not turn to ash in her hands was the one she had once laughed at in the street. She learned he had been arrested, and she understood with a clarity that shamed her that Victor had done it to silence the single person trying to protect her. She did not hesitate. She emptied an account Victor did not control, and she posted Mason's bail, and by the time the paperwork cleared and they let him walk out into the gray morning, she was standing in the cold, outside the station waiting. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. Then Charlotte, who had never in her life apologized to anyone, said, "I'm sorry. For all of it. From the street to now." "We don't have time for sorry," Mason answered not unkindly. "We have time for one thing, and only if we move." The choice he had made in that cell was already behind him. He had a daughter at home, and a mother whose heart was failing, and every instinct of self-preservation told him to take the bail, take his family, and disappear from a war that had never been his to fight. But he had stood in a street once and let the world laugh, and he had promised her he would not run from this. A man is only worth the weight of the things he refuses to take back. They went to Frank. The recording was the key that opened every lock. Federal agents recovered the memory card from the impounded car within hours, and Victor's voice, clear and unhurried, and certain of its own safety, turned a tangle of suspicion into a case. But it did more than that. Mason, listening to the recording again with Frank at his shoulder, caught something he had missed the first time, a detail buried in the talk of logistics. Victor had mentioned a property, a holding owned by one of the shell companies, a warehouse the company books listed as empty and idle. A man hiding a hostage does not improvise. He uses what he already controls, what no one would think to check what appears on no honest ledger, because the ledger itself is a lie. Mason traced the address through the same paper threads he had pulled apart at his kitchen table, and he handed it to Frank, and Frank handed it to people whose work was not done with spreadsheets. They found Daniel that night in a back room of a warehouse the company had supposedly abandoned, frightened and dehydrated, but unharmed. The 2 men guarding him were arrested before they understood the door had opened. When Daniel was brought out into the cold air and saw his sister waiting, he broke, and Charlotte held her brother in the parking lot of a building Victor had used to hide him, and she wept for the first time since the folder, because some weights only fall away when the worst thing you imagined fails to come true. But rescuing Daniel was not the same as winning. Victor still held the votes. The transfer of the family's controlling shares was to be ratified the following morning at an emergency meeting of the shareholders, and once that signature was honored, Victor would own the company, in fact, as well as in theft, and the federal case, however strong, would take months to undo what an hour in a boardroom could make permanent. They could not wait for the slow machinery of justice. They had to break him in the open in front of the only people whose votes could stop him. The meeting convened in the great glass room where Charlotte had so often been questioned, and the irony of it was not lost on her. Victor presided at the head of the long table, gracious and somber, the very picture of a reluctant savior stepping forward in a family's hour of need. The directors who had sold themselves to him sat arranged around the table like furniture. Gerald Pruitt, who had ridden in the back seat the night Mason first heard the truth, sat near Victor's right hand. The transfer documents waited in a neat folder at the center of the table, requiring only the family's signature to become law. Charlotte walked in with Daniel beside her, alive and visibly unharmed, and the first crack appeared in Victor's composure the moment he saw the boy he believed was still in a locked room. Behind them came Mason in the charcoal suit, no longer anyone's furniture. What followed was not a shouting match. Mason did not raise his voice once. He had spent years learning that the truth properly arranged does not need volume. He laid it out the way he had once laid out cases for prosecutors, one clean piece at a time, and the room grew quieter with each one. The vendor that billed for services no one received. The chain of shell companies that funneled the company's money through a dozen names before it vanished. The mailbox in a strip mall that served as the headquarters of a corporation supposedly worth millions. And then when Victor's lawyer began to object that none of this proved intent, Mason played the recording. Victor's own voice filled the glass room. The plan, the timeline, the laughter, the line about Robert being too old to notice, and Charlotte too busy defending herself to defend the company. Every director who had taken his money sat and listened to the man they had backed describe in his own words exactly how he intended to gut the empire they had handed him. The same evidence cut the other way as well. Among the documents Frank's investigators had recovered was the forgery that had put Mason in a cell, and the metadata buried inside it told a plain story to anyone who knew how to read it. The files had not been touched by a driver. They had been created on a machine inside Victor's own office, planted to destroy the one man capable of seeing the scheme for what it was. Mason's name, which he had guarded so carefully through every insult and every humiliation, came back to him clean in front of the very people who had been told he was a thief. Gerald Pruitt was the first to break. A guilty man surrounded by his own voice, and a room full of witnesses does the arithmetic quickly, and Pruitt did it faster than most, turning on Victor in the desperate hope of mercy. Once one director moved, the rest followed the way they always do. The transfer documents were never signed. By the time the federal agents entered the glass room, Victor Hale had stopped performing, and the face beneath the mask was not sorrowful at all. It was the face of a man who had nearly gotten away with everything, and could not understand how a taxi driver had cost him all of it. They let him out past the cameras he had been so fond of, and this time, the story they told was true. Robert Sinclair came back to himself slowly in a quiet hospital room to the news that his daughter had saved the company and his son had come home, and the man he had hired on a reckless instinct had been right about all of it. He was an old man, and the heart that had carried this family had nearly given out under the strain. But it had not, and he lived to see the wreckage cleared. Charlotte was restored as chief executive within the week, the board that had betrayed her dismantled and rebuilt. And when she stood before the cameras at last, she did not talk about quarterly results or shareholder confidence. She told the truth, the whole shape of it, and at the center of the truth, she placed a man she had once mocked in a Chicago street. She admitted what she had said about his car. She admitted what she had thought of him and how wrong every assumption had been. She said, to a city that had watched her laugh at him months before, that Mason Brooks had saved her brother, her father, her company, and the better part of her soul, and that she would spend a long time trying to deserve what he had given her family for nothing. The arrangement her father had once offered out of pity became something else entirely. Mason was given the backing to build the thing he had only ever been able to dream about at his kitchen table, a transport company of his own, run on the principles he had learned from the inside of a taxi, where the drivers were treated as people and not as furniture. Eleanor's surgery was scheduled at the finest cardiac center in the city, paid for in full, and the day Mason told her, she held his hand the way she had held Charlotte's that rainy afternoon, and she did not say anything at all, because some news is too large for words. The heart-shaped jar came down off the windowsill. At last, its work finished. Sophie kept it anyway, empty now, on a shelf in a bigger room, because some things you save are not about the money. The thing between Mason and Charlotte, which had begun as contempt and turned slowly into respect, had become by then something neither of them had gone looking for. It had grown in a back seat, over weeks of quiet conversation, in a small apartment, on a rainy afternoon in the long, terrible nights when the only steady thing in either of their lives had been the other. Neither of them announced it. It did not need announcing. It was simply there, the way solid ground is there after a long time at sea. On a clear afternoon, months later, Charlotte found Mason in a corner of the new company lot, standing in front of a battered yellow taxi he had refused to scrap. He had paid to have it pulled from the impound and parked it there, dented rear, and all among the gleaming new vehicles of the fleet he now owned, and he had never fully explained why. She came and stood beside him, and for a while they only looked at it, the ruined little car that had started everything. "You should have let them junk it," she said, though she did not mean it. I thought about it. Mason ran his hand along the crumpled steel, the same gesture from the day his life had cracked open, except that his hand no longer trembled. But every time I look at it, I remember what I almost lost by keeping my mouth shut, and what I almost gained by giving up. Charlotte looked at the dent her own car had made in his all those months ago, the dent that had cost her the laughter of a crowd and very nearly the laughter of her whole life. When she spoke, her voice was lower than the wind across the lot. "The day I mocked that car," she said, "was the day I almost lost the best person who ever walked into my life." Mason did not answer with words. He took her hand, and together they stood in the long gold light of the afternoon, two people from two worlds that should never have touched, looking at a broken yellow taxi that had somehow carried them both all the way home.